Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. In fact, the very first.
The premiere of season 2026 of the most exciting climate podcast in Australia, an energy podcast you're going to listen to this year. And haven't we got a great premiere this year, Giles? A great guest to kick us off.
I didn't even get to say the first sentence before you interrupted me, and I just wanted to say how your holidays were. But anyway, that was a very, look, it was a welcome intervention, probably badly timed, but I just love the content, David. How were your holidays?
My holidays were great, thanks. We had the 40 for Christmas, and it went successfully despite contrary opinions being expressed by other members ahead of the event. And then we all headed up to Yamba, which was very topical. I'm sure you had great holidays as well, Giles, but it was topical because I looked at the oceans. We saw dolphins regularly, we saw surf, and it made me think about the warming of the oceans and ocean heat content, which is more important than 25% of the CO2 that goes into the ocean, lowering the pH and increasing the acidification. And we found a fantastic guest to talk about that, a real expert, a global expert on the topic.
Yes, well, look, you do like to kick off the annual series of our podcasts with a climate expert, and so we have Matthew England, regarded as Australia's leading ocean modeller and the world's foremost authority on the modelling of the Southern Ocean, it tells me here. We caught up with Matthew England earlier today, and let's hear what he had to say. Professor Matthew England, thank you very much for joining the Energy Insiders podcast.
Great to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
We usually kick the first of the year with a expert in climate science, and this seems a doubly appropriate time this year, given yet more demonstrations of the changing climate. I think that we've seen over recent weeks and recent months. We're going to be sort of focusing on oceans, I think, but we'll be talking more generally about sort of climate science in general. And over the summer, I guess everyone, or mostly everyone, has been in or near or watched the oceans. What have you observed over the last couple of months or even the last year that causes you concern or amplifies your fears about the direction that we're heading?
Yeah, it's a good starting point. Summer definitely is a season where a lot of people take holidays and celebrate a bit of time away from work, but unfortunately, it is actually the season that sees the worst impacts of climate change. Our oceans have warmed significantly over the last 50 years, and so on average, the oceans around Australia, every bit of ocean around Australia is warmer today on average than it was 50 years ago. And in some places, that means we're seeing terrible coral bleaching. In other regions, we're seeing increased humidity for the people who live by the coast. We're seeing sea levels rise and coastal inundation events get worse and more impactful. And that's partly due to sea level rise, the expansion of the oceans due to that warming. So yeah, the oceans have changed in a profound way over the last 50 years. And we see that particularly in summer, as I said, because it's the peak season for seeing the worst impacts of climate change.
And that, I think, we've interchanged a little bit here. As I read about 90% plus of heat goes into the oceans, and then some of it it's why we see the temperature at the surface. Most of the heat is, in fact, a lot deeper than that. And you'll correct me because I'll make so many mistakes, but I understand that means that the heat will be given to get back to equilibrium. The heat will have to be returned once it stops being warmed over a very long period of time.
Yeah, no, all those metrics are correct. More than 90% of the heat that we've trapped in the atmosphere with these greenhouse gases, it seems like it's a good thing when you first hear that. You know, if it was 90% in the atmosphere, we'd be cooking now. We wouldn't be able to live on the land if it was all in the atmosphere. But so it's nice for the heat to get into the ocean away from where we live and breathe. The downside is that ocean warmth, as you mentioned, it doesn't just stay at the surface. It actually goes into the interior. It raises sea levels by reaching those deeper depths. The water column expands, just like a railway track expands on a hot summer's day, and that expansion raises sea level, and the actual return to pre-industrial conditions won't happen. Yeah. Because that heat is actually effectively sequestered for thousands and thousands of years. And so when I say it won't happen for the foreseeable future. Sea levels will continue actually rising because the glacial melt rate is also very slow. And so it's sometimes this is a tough message to convey, to say that we're going to see sea level rise continuing for hundreds to thousands of years, because people then think, well, that's not my problem. It'll be down the track. The issue is that it's already bad because it's causing these inundation events, not just around Australia, but also worldwide, to be more frequent, more severe, and more impactful, and communities are starting to have to move. We saw in 2025 already a number of visas were put up for a ballot in Tuvalu, and there was a big rush on from that community. I think about 80% of the citizens of that country, that island nation that we know is under threat from climate change, there was a huge percentage of them signed up for this ballot. And I think a lot of the people there would much rather, they've got deep cultural connections to the island. It just goes to show how much stress sea level rise is already causing our coastal communities around the world, because there are people who are already having to think about relocating.
Yeah, I'd like to explore some more of that, particularly ocean currents and the glaciers and what have you, and also sort of weather events in Australia and around the world. But just get back to David's point about 90% of the heat has been sort of sequestered in the oceans. That has also served, I guess, to almost bury the problem or drown the problem, if you like.
I just might mention, Giles, while we're doing that, people do question the amount of heat. My understanding is it's a roughly I forget how many zettajoules now, I've just forgotten, but about 8 zettajoules, I think. And I want to ask Matt about acceleration, but what is a zettajoule? Well, all the world's oil, gas, and coal, all the energy in that is about half a zettajoule that we produce a year. So I think we're producing between 30 and 40 times the amount of heat going into the ocean is about 30 to 40 times the amount of energy that we produce. And it's all as a catalyst to producing that thermal energy. It has this incredible accelerant effect. But anyway,
so it's an incredible amount of heat, and we give different numbers. Like the other measure I've seen quoted is number of Hiroshima bombs per second, not just per hour or month. I know when we first used, a colleague of mine, John Cook, came up with the measure. He looked at the amount of heat, the energy being put into the ocean. And when this metric was first devised 20 years ago, it was about 4 Hiroshima bomb explosions per second. It's now up to 8 or 9. So that's that acceleration that you referred to. The rate of change of ocean warming is accelerating. We had a study come out a couple of years ago where we looked at the sort of last 100 years. The uncertainty range has narrowed significantly over the last 40 years because we've got, oceanographers realized this is a really important metric. And in the 1990s, there was a world ocean circulation experiment. It was the largest by scale, the most expensive experiment ever undertaken by humanity at the time, which surprised a lot of people. We thought it was just 20 research vessels trekking around the world making these measurements, but it lasted for 10 years. It was an enormous cost to do this, but this global survey of the oceans in the 90s, and also measurements back in the 80s with expendable bathythermographs. We've got really good records to constrain global ocean heat content today with these robotic floats. But going back in time, we've got really good measurements for the upper 700 meters where most of the heat uptake has occurred going back to the 50s or 60s. So we know with certainty there's been an acceleration in the amount of heat taken up by the ocean. The exact amount in the 50s and 60s and 70s before the wide-scale deployment of oceanographic measuring systems is definitely harder to pin down. But we're talking about, is the acceleration 5-fold or is it 4-fold? Those sorts of uncertainty levels. So we really know with a very strong degree of confidence that the ocean heat uptake is accelerating. And like I said before, it can seem like a good news story because it's burying heat away from the atmosphere. 2 big problems. One is that heat then just radiates back into the atmosphere anyway. It's like having a heater at the base of the 75% of the atmosphere, because that's how much the ocean covers the planet. 75% of the atmosphere feels a constant radiative heating from beneath because we've packed all this heat into the oceans. But also the number of negative impacts of that warming It's a long list, about 10 major items.
I'll come back to the list, and I wanted to also come back to a couple of other things, but you mentioned this acceleration, and I guess with an investment banking background, acceleration and deceleration, there's the things that you always pay a lot of attention to. Maybe you could just talk briefly about what the consensus theories are and explanations for why the acceleration is occurring.
Well, one aspect is that the heat in the atmosphere, like our warming signature in the atmosphere, has accelerated as well. So if you look at the record, I'll run time along this way. If you look at the record of temperature in the atmosphere, it bumped around through the 40s and 50s. We sort of maybe had a bit of delayed warming because of aerosol effects in the 60s and 70s. A lot of air pollution probably shielded some warming back then, and a big uptake in atmospheric warming kicked in the 80s, 90s, maybe stalled for a decade in the early 2000s, kicked up again. So if you look at the last 100 years, there's been an acceleration of warming in the atmosphere, and the oceans are basically playing catch up with that warming. You can imagine the system's very simple. We're trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Sorry, we're trapping heat in the atmosphere due to greenhouse gases. That heat is accumulating energy that then is transported into the ocean. So the ocean's sitting there gaining that extra heat from the atmosphere. If the atmosphere accelerates its warming, as it has done, the ocean will also do that. The other factor is that the oceans aren't just sort of like a sort of stagnant, pond of water that sort of sits there passively absorbing that heat. There's very significant large-scale mixing of the ocean, both laterally, both horizontally, with these large-scale circulation fields, the gyres and the eddies that move water around the planet in the horizontal sense. But there's also a very significant overturning of heat in the vertical sense. So into the deep ocean, we have a lot of heat in the North Atlantic and around the Southern Ocean that's invading the deep ocean. And again, it's kind of good that we have that because we're burying heat out of the surface layer where biology sits into the deeper ocean, away from where most of the ecosystems are, away from where humans live. But the downside is, like I said, it raises sea levels and other things.
I'm going to hand back in just a second, but I did just want to talk, since you mentioned currents, and there's so many topics like the meridional circulation and things, and that we could talk about but I think as far as Australia goes, and because we're a coastal population, really what's happening on the coast of Australia and the weather is of immediate effect to all of our to a large percentage of our population. And when I was trying to get ready for this topic, and I came across these Hadley cells, which suggest that we're going to see more warming on our latitude, and the same in the northern hemisphere on an equivalent latitude, because the warm air in the tropics is essentially being pushed further and further south as the heating increases. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's very true, that the Hadley cells, these are, if you think about here's the Earth, and radiation of sun hits the tropics more than the high latitudes, but it creates an upward motion of air right in the tropics. When you fly in a plane over the tropics, you'll often go through turbulence. Some of this is updraft of air that can travel at really rapid velocities because of the warm air rises, and that sets up these Hadley circulation cells. And yeah, all the evidence we have is that they're expanding. So those Hadley cells actually descend at the latitude where we have deserts, so the Sahara or the great expanse of deserts across Australia and other nations at about 30 south and 30 north. Now that descending air is much drier and creates those desert latitudes, but the actual tropical, that range of latitudes that has moist air, tropical conditions, the evidence we have is that it's expanding, not necessarily right around the globe at the same amount. It seems to be expanding particularly strongly in the West Pacific, so around Australia's longitudes. But yeah, no, we have evidence that, and we're seeing sort of anecdotal evidence of that with some of the summer conditions we've had over the last decade or so. I think a lot of Brisbane residents, even people down far south of Sydney, would say they've felt much more humidity over the summer months than previously. That's the sort of expansion of the tropics. This sort of wet, humid air mass is creeping further poleward as the decades roll on.
And then I guess as the oceans off in the Tasman, and I believe, and it's complicated because you've got the polar flows as well, or Antarctic flows, but polar flows. But and I'm way out of my depth. But as the oceans warm off the coast of Australia, maybe you could talk a little bit about what it means, not so much for humidity, but also for weather in general, like the higher ocean levels, which come from the runoff as much as the heat in the ocean. I mean, it means tides will start 20 centimetres higher, probably going to be 30 centimetres higher in another decade or something like that. And that means that we're going to get more, we are going to continue to see more coastal flooding and more like, I think we call them rain bombs on Channel 10, don't we, or something like that?
Yeah, no, actually we're seeing this worldwide. The increased moisture content of the atmosphere, there's a very fixed relationship between how warm the atmosphere and how much moisture it can hold. And for every degree Celsius that we warm the atmosphere by, you get approximately a 7% increase in humidity, which doesn't sound like much, but 7% humidity on average is a lot. It's a big increase. And we're seeing some of the effects of that extra moisture in the atmosphere is that these flash flooding events, I mean, we've seen terrible instances of this through many nations in Europe, Spain and Germany, Japan, China, around our area. Even off Australia, we've had some catastrophic flooding rains in the last decade or so that have broken all sorts of records. And part of that is just loading up the atmosphere with more moisture, which comes from a warmer ocean. So the reason there's more moisture in the atmosphere is you've got a warmer ocean evaporating that moisture into the atmosphere. And it means that of the range of rain events we get, the sort of distribution is being shifted towards the wetter end. So the very extreme high rainfall events that, flash floods over 24 hours, those return periods are decreasing, and I think we saw it even just the rainfall that fell in Sydney this weekend past we broke all sorts of records. We're seeing those flash flooding rains hit those records, and it's having a huge, devastating impact on livelihoods, on insurance policies, on agriculture, and so on.
Roads and fences. I'm handing back to Giles, but there's a study that I think Climate Watch or Weather Watch does in the USA that looks at the frequency of US $1 billion disaster events. And I was looking at that. It used to be 20 or 30 days between a 1 billion event, and now it's down to 10 every 10 days. Anyway, Giles.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And you talk about those rain bombs and the warming oceans, and you can actually even point to some of the shocking events we've seen in Sydney over the last week, the shark attacks, and you can possibly link them to warming oceans, change of activity, the rain events which flood sewerage and waste into the waters, which attracts the sharks and what have you. It's sort of, it's very much
That knock-on effect is really important because in the field I'm in, I'll talk about sea level rise, acidifying oceans, coral bleaching, these humidity, rain events, drought cycles, but this whole range of ecosystem changes. And the example you mentioned of these shark instances, it's been linked to the increased rainfall, that brackish water. The bull sharks love to go to those very sediment-rich, nutrient-rich water regions. They snap away. Their vision is very poor anyway, and so if it's brackish water, it's even worse. And they often don't intend to necessarily go attack a human, but they're looking for food constantly, and the risk of having that sort of water opacity is that, as I understand it from shark experts, is that the sharks don't see very well, and if they saw the size of a human, clearly they might actually tend to swim away because it looks a bit too big as prey. But if the water's murky,
they kind of bump into it and start biting. Yeah. Can we just go through to some of the other sort of the broader impacts? And I'm kind of interested in a bunch of different things here. One is on the ocean currents, and you're an expert in those ocean currents. We've got one that goes below Australia. I can't quite remember what it's called. You're going to remind me very, very soon. Yeah. And or David is.
It's the East Australian current, which is the north-south flow, I think, isn't it? And
there's one thing,
but the one
across the bottom. Matthew?
The Antarctic circumpolar current is the one that flows right around the Southern Ocean. So it flows south of Australia, across to South America, south of Africa. And
And what happens to that as the oceans warm, the ice melts, and it becomes, there's less seawater? What has happened to those currents? What are the implications of those? Is it like the one in the Atlantic, which slows down and then people fear that it might have dramatic changes on the European climate?
Yeah.
Let's start off with Australia first.
Yeah. So, I mean, the boundary, so East Australia current is what we call a western boundary current. It sounds funny when you first hear that because it's the east coast of Australia, but it's the western boundary of an ocean. Mm-hmm. All of the world's western boundary currents are actually increasing in their intensity. And the reason they've done that, and the western boundary currents, we've got the East Australia current off our coast, the Agulhas off South Africa, the Brazil current off Brazil. In the North Atlantic, there's the Gulf Stream, not to be confused with the overturning there, which I'll get to in a second, and the Kuroshio off Japan. Those 5 currents have all increased significantly in their intensity over the last 50 or so years. And part of that is driven by wind changes. The winds over the ocean have gotten stronger at about 40 south and 40 north. And that spins up what we call a gyre. It's a large scale, basin scale eddy in effect. It sort of takes let's focus on off the coast of Eastern Australia. The large scale gyre goes from Chile, water is brought up to the tropics, it flows down south of Australia, then recirculates. It's like a giant air conditioner for the world's climate because it takes cold water south of Chile up to the tropics to keep the tropics cooler, which is nice for those latitudes. The tropical water picks up heat, brings the warmth down the east coast of Australia. We get very mild winters as a result. Anybody living right along the coast of Eastern Australia has a much more mild, has lower energy bills in winter to do anything because of that ocean warmth. And likewise in summer, it moderates the climate. So those currents are increasing, but other aspects of the circulation, what we call these overturning circulations, both in the North Atlantic and the abyssal overturning around Antarctica, which puts water right into the, as the name suggests, right into the abyssal layers of the ocean, the very bottommost 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers of water globally is fed by these very isolated regions of Antarctica where you get the densest and coldest water globally. Now those waters we know are freshening because of meltwater, and like the North Atlantic equivalent, all the evidence we have is that overturning is slowing down around Antarctica. And so the answer to your question is not just a uniform one, the current speeding up or slowing down. Each circulation system has a different driver, and overall these lateral gyre circulations I mentioned are spinning up because of the wind fields, whereas the overturning circulations down to the deep layers of the ocean, they are slowing down because we're both warming and freshening the surface of the ocean. And warm water and fresher water don't sink nearly as effectively as icy cold, salty water.
Yeah. You put out a report last August, I think, sort of warning about the accelerated melt in Antarctica and things like that, and the potential catastrophic effects. Maybe just remind us what the main findings and what your main concerns are there. And you talk about the potential collapse of I think it's the West Antarctic ice sheet.
Yeah.
How close are we to that? I mean, how real is that?
It's a really important part of our climate system. Antarctica is a major driver of how the planet's climate is. It also sets our sea levels. The amount of ice we have piled up on Antarctica at the moment is equivalent to over 50 meters of sea level rise, 50 meters of sea level rise. If we lost all of that ice, we do believe the East Antarctic ice sheet, which has most of that 57 meters or so, we believe most of it is stable. When I say most, if we have a couple of meters that aren't stable, that's a big rise in sea levels. I think David mentioned earlier, it's been 20 centimeters so far. If we add a couple of meters onto that, we're talking about, hundreds of millions of people displaced and actually coastal Sydney being almost unviable in many suburbs at that level of sea level rise. Now,
and that's despite house prices. Sorry, keep going.
It is. I mean, and we've had, I shouldn't start. Well, I will. We've said these things about the threats to Sydney's coastline, and we do get calls from real estate agents saying to us, don't say that. You're making it hard for me to sell a property, by the beach at, a suburb like Narrabeen or Colorado where these big inundations have occurred. But this is a real thing. In Japan, I had colleagues live there to teach English in 30 years ago. And when they got to Japan, they were staggered that these waterfront properties were half the price of stuff inland. Hang on, we can have ocean views and you're going to charge us half the amount. And you could probably guess why it was half the price. The perception of the risk of a tsunami, even though it was very low probability, the perception that was a risk, and that was before the Fukushima design. So it's founded, but they did not want to live by the coast. And unfortunately, as we move forward into decades, there will be, not every coastal property is right down at sea level, but those that are really at risk of getting smashed by these big storm events.
Yeah. Well, I see that up in Byron Bay, actually. Got a onshore, I think, is where all the multi-millionaires live. Yeah. And they've been reinforcing their homes down there with sort of impromptu rock walls and things like that. They've asked the council to build a 10-meter wall, but the council says no because they can't keep on doing that. But now they've taken out the backs of the homes. They've had conveyor belts going through the garage and out the back, and sort of dumping it over the sides, putting concrete into the sand dunes.
More prosaically, these continual coastal flooding events like do road damage, and it takes years to fix up one road, and then as the frequency increases, you get fences damage, as we've seen in North Queensland. You get stock losses. At the same time, for reasons that perhaps we could come on to, the south of Australia has become drier and more arid, and also inland Australia has become drier and more arid, I think it's fair to say, to an extent. This is something to do also with the ocean currents and maybe their effect on the winds and things. A lot of us won't properly understand, Matt, exactly why it is that one area can be getting wetter on average and another dry.
Yeah, and so it's a good topic. And unfortunately for Australia, the mantra we used to say when this sort of research first came out was the wet gets wetter and the dry gets drier. We overall saw all of the climate projections, virtually all of them 30 years ago, were showing, where it's wet already, so the tropics, the projections were for increased rainfall there, and where it's dry already, those desert latitudes I mentioned earlier, projections would get drier. And it's sort of partly the expansion of that Hadley cell that I mentioned. That intensification means drier conditions with the descending air hitting those desert latitudes. We've also got something, the wind belt around the Southern Ocean. So I spoke about the flow there in the ocean, but in the atmosphere, there's a westerly wind field that circles the globe. And
is that the Coriolis? Or I can't even pronounce it.
Coriolis is the rotation effects of the Earth, but the rotation effects of the Earth affect all these large-scale winds and ocean flows. But like we refer to El Niño as this mode of variability in the Pacific, we call a wobble in this wind field south of Australia. It's referred to as the southern annular mode, and it's called southern because it's to the south. The reason we say annular is that it's actually a wind field that circles the globe. It's like a donut, effectively, sort of, but at the bottom of the sphere of the Earth, a flow of air around in an annular, if you like the shape. And that annular flow of air, under global warming, as we increase greenhouse gases, but also with ozone depletion, that airflow has increased in its speed, and also it's shifted south a little bit. So unfortunately, the storm tracks that bring rainfall to the south of Australia, they're dumping more rainfall over the Southern Ocean instead of dumping that rain over Australia. Of course, we do get rain events coming off the Southern Ocean to Australia, but the frequency and intensity has declined, especially WA. The rainfall there has decreased significantly over the last 50 years, and it's been categorically linked to this southward shift, this southward migration of the southern annular mode.
That's interesting. And lost my train of thought very slightly. So, Giles, I'm going to hand back to you for a second. I had it all lined up, and then I got so interested I lost track.
In the US, climate funding has been obliterated by the Trump administration. I mean, you can barely even see the word climate now. In fact, even the word renewables is being sort of taken out from sort of key institutions, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and things like that. You've just landed some funding, which is reassuring, I think, for work in Australia. Before you tell us exactly what that is, what's your response what are your thoughts when you see what's happening in the US? Because they've got very valuable institutions and very, very valuable data, which are actually critical for the global understanding of what's happening in the climate.
Yeah.
I might mention just the latest ocean heat thing was a huge collaboration between largely American and Chinese authors. And as far as I know, that's what's been happening for years when I read it. And, in terms of the technology, there's some Chinese satellites now measuring ocean heat at the surface. I'll be corrected on all of this. And we should thank a guy called, I think, Matthew Romich, is it? Dean Romich, for putting all the 4,000 wonderful Argo boys in the water that sit around.
Dean was on the call. He'd say it wasn't just me; it was many others. There's a guy called Russ Davis who kind of is considered a bit of a forefather of those robotic floats, as well as Dean from Scripps. Both amazing oceanographers. But yeah, it's been a worldwide latching onto that technology. Previously, we used to rely on ocean vessels to go around the world's oceans, making those measurements. These Argo floats, you drop them into the ocean, they have battery lives that last insanely long. I'm so surprised they can last as long as they do, multiple years, making the equivalent of measurements of millions and millions of dollars of ship time to make those measurements over 5-6 years. These Argo floats are doing it for us robotically, remotely, sending the data back through satellites. Back to your question, Giles, about the US. The problem is, I think about half the floats globally were from the US up to a couple of years ago. Now, China's stepping up, the Europeans, the Australians, a lot of nations throw these Argo floats into their bit of ocean. But our US colleagues were absolute leaders in terms of the technology. As you mentioned, Dean, Remick, Russ Davis, others got that up and running, technology, but also in terms of deployment, they led. And so if we take out the Argo floats, one of my colleagues went to a model simulation and he's just synthetically removed all the Argo floats that were from the US. How is my model if I remove that data stream? And it fell over. It didn't produce, it couldn't even find where the eddies were in the ocean. The flow fields became erroneous. And a lot of these floats are sitting where the El Niño, La Niña event develops in the East Pacific Ocean. So they're critical parts of the ocean for Australia. So it's not just a US problem. It's a global problem to lose those capabilities. And Giles, as you framed your question, there's decades and decades of expertise, amazing scientists, amazing technology, and they're pushing those people and technologies off a cliff, effectively, off a fiscal cliff, closing down labs. I heard some things were reversed or blocked by Congress. May that continue to happen? It seems like a vengeful, childish attack on science in some parts, because I had to use that word because, for example, NCAR got targeted the other day, and what I understood is that it's in Boulder, in Colorado, and suddenly the Trump administration was angry with one of the politicians at Colorado. Oh, there's a lab there. Okay, we'll attack that. NCAR had been left alone. It actually underpins the US weather prediction services as well. It's not just about climate change. So even if you completely discard climate change and pretend it's a Chinese hoax, which it's not, but even if you did that, the mere fact that the US is so susceptible to extremes of climate, extreme swings in El Niño, La Niña, these catastrophic fires, for example, in California.
$1 billion every 10 days, 90 billion a year. I think even the most dumbest US politician will listen to people who tell him you've got to have reasonable weather forecast, and that's my point. Except, and Stephen Miller. But look, we're not here to do a politics thing, much as I would like.
That was better good news. No, I just want to, part two of my question. Sorry to interrupt, David. To just clarify one thing: are they not having the data from those floats now? Or are they actually taking the floats out of the water?
No.
And do please tell us about your funding, because you've actually got good news on funding.
Yeah, so those floats will stay in the water. They're generally, unfortunately, hard to find. Sometimes people find an Argo float at the end of their life, so it's worth retrieving and fit a new battery system in. But the floats aren't being taken out of the water, but the data streams and the quality control of that data, all of that curating of the data that then gets delivered to the science community, that's been cut off, and a lot of people are being sacked who did that work in the US. There's enough people in the US, in Europe and other nations to pick up some of that, but we're losing there's real threats to the data that we've relied on for many decades now. And yes, that funding we got, it was very good news to get this. A consortium of about 28 or so of my colleagues in ocean sciences put together a proposal to fund a new center, bringing together the main university research organizations in marine sciences, the oceanography of the sea around Australia. So we're looking at exactly how Australia's oceans are changing. That means all of the oceans out across the Pacific to span the driving agents of what we get around the Australian landmass. So the Indian Ocean, the Pacific are the main ocean basins, and the oceans just to the south of Australia. But it's a real focus on our exclusive economic zone, so the band of ocean around Australia, to understand how marine heat waves are changing, how hypoxia events like the horrible event off South Australia, this big toxic algal bloom, what sort of conditions drive that? What's the future hold? Are our projections for sea level rise fit for purpose? Do we know yet? Can we predict sea level rise, not just to the scale of it's going to be higher by a certain amount around Australia, but it's going to be variable whether you're in Queensland at the tropics or down off Brisbane, down the New South Wales coast. All these regions have different oceanography, and what the centre is going to do is take this sort of coarse understanding we have at the moment and bring it down to spatial scales that a marine park ranger can use to inform. Is this marine park that we've set up as a spot for no fishing, is that big enough? Do we need to move it south because all of those species are shifting south as climate change? So a lot of questions to answer, but the main thing, if I can put it in one sentence, we're all about delivering Australia the oceanographic knowledge it needs to do the best we can with our oceans. We live by the coast. We use the oceans as a source of food. More and more we'll use it as a place to get energy. How do we do all those things in a way that protects the oceans, but also makes sure that we don't do things like set up a national marine park in an area, for example, for the barrier reef, that's not the right place to do that. So we really want to protect our oceans and make sure that we have a healthy ocean environment and healthy ocean industries for.
So, that would make me ask about ocean acidification, and that the pH has changed, and that's maybe a 25%, but and the consequences of that. But time does press on. I've had this burning issue that ENSO conditions, La Niña, El Niño, which is about the only kind of weather I remember from the 1960s when my mum used to tell me about it, has a big impact on global warming. But I've always been interested as well in the counter effect. What is the effect of global warming on La Niña and El Niño? Does it make one or the other more likely? And what's the interaction of it actually mean for us, and how often I have to turn my air conditioning on or something?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, what we have predicted decades ago already from the models is playing out. And so one of the things that we looked at almost 20 years ago now is that exact question you asked: how will global warming influence that major mode of variability? And there's a couple of things we found out. One was that El Niño cycles, like the extreme El Niños that occur, the very worst ones, the return period of those shortens as global warming progresses. We also found that La Niñas didn't necessarily become more intense, but their impacts became more intense. And so the La Niñas that we saw in these projections out to the future, they didn't necessarily, unlike the El Niños that got more intense, the La Niñas were sort of similar magnitude, but their impact on neighboring nations was worse. And part of that's this increased hydrological cycle, increased humidity that we've seen in the last couple of decades. And the third thing that I think is really important, and unfortunately, again, we've seen it play out the last decade, is that we'd have very fewer and fewer of these neutral years. And so for the listeners, you hear about El Niños and La Niñas, you don't often hear about the neutral years. And what a neutral year is, it's a year when we don't have an El Niño and we don't have a La Niña. Conditions are just kind of average, and they're nice because it means we don't have bushfire conditions off Australia. We don't have flooding rains off Australia. Equally over around the Americas, their extremes are, the bushfires you saw off California during a La Niña event. So it's a getting off the question a little bit, but La Niñas and El Niños have opposite effects either side of the Pacific. When it's droughts conditions for Australia, it'll be flooding rains for Peru and parts of the Americas. So unfortunately, those neutral year instances are declining, and we've seen that over the last 20 or 30 years. Very few years come along. Of the last 10 years, I think only two or so are neutral years. Going back in the record 30, 40 years ago, a typical decade would only have one or two, one El Niño, one maybe La Niña, maybe two. You have 6 or so neutral years. And so the incidence of these neutral years seems to be declining. And that's very much consistent with what these climate model projections forecast. You can think of it as an intensification. In a way, climate change brings an intensification of all of our weather and climate systems.
More variability in essence. Well, I can keep going for a while yet, but Giles?
Yeah, look, my final question is really just about the state of the climate policy and the climate transition, energy transition in Australia. I mean, obviously, you're looking at some of the impacts and the problems, most of them hidden from public view because no one's down 1,000 meters down in the oceans and not paying much attention to that. We've got news this week of the extension of the Raraing coal-fired generator. Today we hear about the extension for another coal generator over in Western Australia. I don't know. It's just it's frustrating for those people sort of deeply attached to the energy transition and the speed and wishing we could go faster and we should go faster. Lots of reasons given that we can't go faster, but that's often down to poor effort. I mean, I guess it's an opportunity for you just to sort of say how critical it is that we actually take this science seriously. And, 1.5 is what we should be aiming for. 2 might be good enough.
Yeah,
2.5 is kind of catastrophic. I mean, we've
exactly
kind of got to put our fingers out.
Yeah, no, exactly. And even 1.5 is risky. So it's not even about risk. So, and every 10th of a degree we ramp up towards 2. And then beyond that, it just loads up higher and higher risk. And the analogy, it's a brutal one, but it's a good one. It's like having a revolver and adding more and more bullets to a Russian roulette game. It just doesn't end well. You don't want to do this. And you're right, we are transitioning far too slowly. I want to change the answer a little bit. Not only are we doing it too slowly, but unfortunately, all of the technologies that we have are available there already. We have a huge amount of, Australia's so well positioned to go to net zero emissions. Our energy through the sun is massive. We've got fantastic reserves of a lot of the precious metals and also things like lithium and silicates and so on that are needed for solar cells and solar energy systems. So we've got the minerals and the technology. We've got leading solar scientists who've actually led the world in producing the solar panel technology, not just used in Australia, but used worldwide. And so all the ingredients are right for Australia to be transitioning to a net zero world where solar plus wind plus electrification of our grid, electrification of our transport vehicles, especially road and train, could be happening at a much faster pace. And we already saw the announcement recently. I thought it was a great bit of news, the 3 hours of free energy in the middle of the day, because Australia's energy uptake through domestic solar has been fantastic. We've got a huge amount of energy that's getting onto the grid through people's roofs, and it can be shared and taken up free of charge during those daylight hours. What we need now is that extra pickup with solar going to battery storage. People are driving EVs, but there's technologies now to sort of plug your EV into your house. You don't, batteries are expensive.
We get all that. I mean, we could talk about that till the end. That's what we talk about for the rest of the year, Matt. I'm going to bring you back a little bit to, I guess, academia, which I think I mentioned in my email to you. I am imagining, and you can correct me, that there is a considerable interest from students in studying climate science these days as it becomes something that affects everyday life more, and where I guess students think they can make a difference, which is something that some of us are always trying to do. I went so far as to suggest to one of my grandkids the other day that they should be a meteorologist, because I reckon they'd be in high demand and you need a lot of skill for it. But I guess what I'm asking is, how is the overall attitude within universities, which after all drive most of the productivity growth at the very end of the day that we tend to see in the economy, drive how we understand things and know things? How's it all going?
Yeah, no, the interest from students has really picked up. We've got a course, a climate change, introduction to climate change science, climate science course. It's now broken through 1,000 students per annum. About 10 years ago when it was launched, or maybe 15 years now, we were sitting at a tenth of that, I think, the first couple of years it ran. So we had about 50 students across 2 sessions, so 100 all up, and today I think it's getting up towards 1,100, 1,200. So there's a huge appetite, and it does cut across so many sectors, from law to the built environment, engineering, clearly, medicine, public health, all of the disciplines we teach at university, all those fields are impacted by climate change. So there is an appetite for understanding how things are changing, for understanding how those different sectors will be impacted by climate change.
Well, Matthew, I kind of sort of feel I've got so many more questions about the barrier reef, about the Arctic, the Antarctic, and things like that. But we are running out of time. We do thank you for your time today. So thank you very much for joining the Energy Insiders podcast and sort of setting the agenda for the year on a reminder of the climate science, which is kind of the basis of everything that all the other decisions that we need to make.
No, look, thanks so much for having me, and I really enjoyed the question set. It was from 2 very informed people, so thank you so much.
I wish we were more informed and could ask. Can I just finish off by asking, what's at the cutting edge on your research agenda at the moment? What do you see as the most pressing questions which would further the science?
Yeah, look, I mean, what I'm really concerned about is this ocean heat uptake. That's one of the biggest things we're looking at. Everything from the coral reefs that are getting smashed by these catastrophic marine heat waves, but also other part of the planet going up under the ice shelves around Antarctica. There are bits of those ice shelves we're only getting to for the first time today, and we're seeing temperatures there that are shocking us. You know, we're seeing temperatures that are far warmer than we thought we'd see there. We don't have measurements going back in time. First measurement ever that we see at some of these ice shelves, and the temperatures we're seeing there are concerning because we don't think that amount of warmth can sit there off an ice shelf and not melt it back in a very significant way. And once you do that, you release the ice sheets behind them to flow into the ice shelves themselves are floating, but they're a very protective boundary for the ice sheets that do raise sea levels. So it's that spreading of warm water across the world's oceans to the deepest depths, right to the poles and across the reef systems, is what's driving a lot of the research I'm doing.
And I have to ask, why can we measure it now? Is it the technology or the boats? I mean, are we seeing technology advances still? I'm interested in that in every field.
Yeah, it's a good question. A bit of both. We've got boats that can now go through sea ice and be built to encounter icebergs and not sink. That's very important to get right to the ice shelf margin. But also we've got these new robotic floats that can be autonomously, driven beneath the ice shelves. They can do a little transect right, many kilometers under the ice shelf, take measurements top to bottom, then come back out. So that sort of new technologies, robotic floats are helping out a lot.
That's good. And maybe if Elon Musk focused a little bit more on that and a little bit less on going to Mars, we might make even faster progress. Thank you so much, Professor Matthew England. It is absolute pleasure to be able to
Thanks
talk
so much.
And that was Matthew England. I should say that it comes from the University of New South Wales, and also Director of a new ARC from the Centre of CRC, the research organisations. Pretty interesting stuff, David. I'm just sort of fascinated by the oceans. I mean, it's the sort of that store of heat which is going to come back and kill us all, I think, once it's released. And the thing that's managed to sort of hide the climate change from plain view, I think.
Well, Giles, I'm not surprised you're fascinated by oceans, living up there at Byron Bay and being a keen surfer. But I don't think you're the only one to fall into that category. And as we noted, most of Australia's population lives along the coast. There's 1 million houses that can't get flood insurance now. And it'll probably be a lot more in another decade. And as I mentioned myself, there's the road damage from storms. There's fencing damage from storms. There's livestock loss from storms. Their insurance costs are way up. People talk about rising electricity prices, which actually have not risen much more than inflation. But anyway, we'll have plenty more to say on, I hope, climate change, to cover developments as the year progresses. Probably we should talk about some of the other events. What's caught your mind over the break?
Well, over the break, there was a few things happening. A couple of batteries were started operating. One at Eraring, which we'll get to soon. That's the first stage of what will be for a while the biggest battery.
Eraring? Did you say Eraring?
Oh, it's at Eraring. Yes, I know. We're going to get to that very soon with the coal. I just wanted to try and go for the good news first. I'm trying to anyway. Acacia Energy has finished its Brendale battery. The first it's done with Tesla. Still no word on what's happening with Waratah, which got upset by a transformer failure. And a couple of wind farms, notably the Palmer wind farm, which would be touting all the second half of last year, but end up coming fourth in the race for financial close. And Andrew Forrest with the Nullagine wind farm, 133 megawatts up in the Pilbara, to help him reach real zero and the first to use these sort of self-lifting turbines that we discussed with Dino Otranto in an episode on this podcast last year. But the bad news, of course, David, is the closure or the extension.
Well, before we get to the bad news, let's keep going on the good news. The good news is that for the last 3 months, essentially, spot electricity prices, not retail prices, not forward prices, but spot electricity prices, have been down about 15 to 20% on the previous corresponding period. And that's been driven by better wind output compared to last year, a more average year for wind. But mainly by, particularly in the peak hours, by batteries coming on and taking market share away from gas. And the higher wind output, together with the batteries taking share away from gas, has meant lower coal output, lower coal revenue in that key period. And as we know, coal's already losing lots of revenue to solar in the middle of the day. The significance of the lower spot prices, assuming and this is the time when spot prices are generally low, but the significance of the lower prices, if they continue, is it will feed through into retail prices eventually in due course when the AER publishes its next or the one after set of DMO. It happens only with a lag, but it is essentially good news. It shows that when you get more supply, not just in the middle of the day, but more supply into the evening peak, and more suppliers, then good things can start to happen from a consumer point of view. And so from Origin's point of view, as we come onto the Eraring power station, which has been kept open for a variety of reasons, one of which I'm sure you want to tell me is because AEMO's not been aggressive enough on inverter-led responses, and it wants the system frequency control aspects of Eraring as much as the power and energy from it. Is that correct?
Well, pretty much, really, because I think the New South Wales Energy Minister made pretty clear that there's going to be enough wind and solar and battery storage to sort of fill in these supply gaps in terms of power needs for Eraring. And Origin Energy cited very clearly and up high and quite prominently in their own release the Security Transition Report. Now, you may remember the other episode that we did, the other interview we did with Nicola Falcon from AEMO late last year, talking about this issue, talking about the shortfalls in sort of system strength and whether synchronous condensers or grid-forming inverters can fill that job. The reality is that at the moment we don't accept Tesla and Fluence's work word that they can fulfill all the requirements of system strength. So we're counting on synchronous condensers. Synchronous condensers are big, heavy, very odd machines, which are almost impossible to buy at the moment and really expensive. So that's basically the reason, because we sort of haven't yet done the test that we need to do. And one of them is going to be this sort of world first test with 100 megawatts isolated grid in the national electricity market running with engines off. So no spinning machines. Until we've done that and accepted that Tesla is right and Fluence is right and the other battery makers are right, we've got this dependence on spinning machines. And because we can't get the bloody things, we've got to keep these other coal-fired power stations open. And so that's right. The reality, but it's a sad one and one that could have been avoided, I think.
Well, I think it could have been avoided, but I think Eraring's output will fall a bit. I'd add two other things. One is that we haven't yet started the wind farms that are going to be the long-term replacement for Eraring, and they won't be built. They'll even struggle to be online, quite frankly, by 2029.
Yes, so the rate they're going, yes.
But the second thing is that actually, whilst I agree with you 100% about synchronous condensers and grid-forming inverters, and everyone knows I'm the world's greatest power engineer and understand these things better than any scientist or engineer. Not. But I do read, as you do. I accept all that, and I suspect that even AEMO actually accepts it. But I'm prepared to cut AEMO some slack on that. When they do their ISP, Dan Westerman, the CEO, they go bold. They endorse wind and solar as the way of the future, as we all do, because that's where science and economics drives us, and policy. But they go cautious on system services, and even though they probably know themselves that they don't, but they're entitled to have a bit of caution in mind. I just cut them the slack.
No, I get that. We've seen South Australia, we've seen Spain. So if you get something wrong there, it looks really bad, and that sort of sets the whole thing back. But I guess, you know, when you listen to people like Matthew England, you just realise the urgency of the situation, and then you wonder, have we been urgent enough? Have we been quick enough? We know that the utilities are not moving anywhere near as fast because they have no motivation to do so. So we just have to rely. And if we're going to get this done, we've got to learn from this and increase the.
It won't surprise me if Eraring, and by the end of it, next year, maybe so much in 2026, but 2027 is a decent wind year. It won't surprise me if Eraring's availing itself of that subsidy. It'll be really struggling by then, I suspect, and output will be down. I want to come on to something else, Giles. This is a year we've got three big policies. Because we don't have a carbon price and scheme, we have to go about policy in a whole lot of other ways. So we've had gas reforms, we've had the home battery scheme, we've got a bunch of other policies. Now, this year we're having a review of the safeguards scheme, which I would argue safeguards has been pretty ineffective so far, and probably the main thing is the ACCUs as much as anything else. But also most of safeguards, what it's really doing is safeguarding coal and gas production, because that makes up about 50% or 60% of the total facilities covered under safeguards. And as we know, we're getting more LNG plants. So those guys are getting safeguarded, possibly. And that's one review that we can talk about. It hasn't formally started yet, but it's due to be done this year. We've got a review of the fringe benefits tax scheme for EVs. But I regard that actually as secondary to the review of EV strategy, which is due to take place this year. And I think Australia has an absolutely fantastic opportunity in EVs to go hard. We know that the population generally supports doing things on climate change, but even if they didn't, we import a net $40 billion worth of oil. Think how much effort it is to get an export industry equal to $40 billion. You know, we can't do that, but we can cut out all those imports, and it essentially costs us nothing, because if we import electric cars instead of petrol cars, the net cost is going to be zero. So when you look at the countries where, and our Asian neighbours are doing this, not just China, but Thailand's up to 20-something% of EVs from nowhere a couple of years ago. Vietnam's up to 40% of EVs. They've got their own local EV manufacturer. India's going to be looking at China and Vietnam and saying, well, we don't make petrol cars very much. Well, let's get into this new industry, EVs, and that like these other Asian countries doing. We're not going to get into manufacturing, but we've got a very, very easy win by making EVs attractive to consumers. We can make this $40 billion. Now, the net present value of that is an enormous number over time. It will far outweigh the cost. How do you do it? You put in more charging infrastructure. We need to about quadruple the rate of charging installations that we're doing so far. And make them far more reliable and just completely eliminate that as a concern for all consumers. And then we need to make EVs cheaper relative to petrol cars. And when I read the research, you don't do that by giving necessarily direct subsidies per se. You do it by reducing the taxes on electric cars compared to the existing taxes on petrol cars. Now, we don't actually have so many taxes on petrol cars in Australia compared to some other countries in the world, like, say, Denmark, Holland, or the Netherlands. That's the same. But what we do have is GST. And we could cut out GST, for instance, just putting that idea out there, and cut the price of EVs by 10% straight like that. And it would be a far more widespread benefit to the community than the fringe benefit tax, which is only available, let's face it, to a small fraction of all the people that might be interested.
Well, that's interesting. And what about the road tax? Because aren't we thinking about putting a road tax on EVs now?
This goes to the sort of what I might call class consciousness that exists within the older parts of the Labor Party that says that EVs go to all young yuppies who can afford it, if you like what I mean. And don't go to ordinary working class people and tradies and stuff like that. And therefore, let's put an EV road tax on them and stuff them. I just don't think they've got their. And I think, to be fair to Jim Chalmers, and I don't know this for a fact, but I read that actually the federal government has seen the light on this. So I actually think that the home battery scheme has obviously been a tremendous success for Chris Bowen. Mm-hmm. And it's going to continue being a success. And it wins votes. When 200,000 people put in a home battery already, and there's going to be lots more, that's a vote winner. There's nothing like been associated with success. And I reckon he has an opportunity to be successful on EVs. And there's far more cars in Australia than there will ever be home batteries. It's a very big opportunity.
No, and I think you're absolutely right, because I think, this whole green energy transition, whether it be through cars or through the grid, is getting blocked by big legacy incumbents because they're just not moving quick enough. They have no reason to move. They're making profits out of combustion cars. They're making profits out of gas and coal-fired power stations. So really, the best way to accelerate this transition and to make it more acceptable by the population is to give them the resources, to help them have the resources. So that's rooftop solar, that's battery storage, that's EVs. I just think that's an absolute critical part of the equation. And
yeah, Giles, and when you look at it, China's no doubt subsidised its EV manufacturing industry. If you read the reports, they've probably put between $200 and $300 billion of subsidies. They've paid for our EVs, right? We can get cheap cars by taking advantage of all the money that China's invested on our behalf.
Yeah.
We should do it while it's cheap, while we can. And, you look at the other things. We get rid of the oil dependence that we have. But actually, Australia's fundamentally a great place for electric cars. We've got a temperate climate, so we don't have the same winter suffering that some people, and it's not even all that hilly. Not that those things matter all that much, but it's an ideal place to have an electric car, is Australia.
Well, that's right. Well, that goes against the sort of current thing that it's all so far away that we'll run out. We won't be able to make it to our camping ground, but of course you can. We went camping with our EV for several days in the national park, and that was a lot of fun. David, I think that's about it. I just want to mention a couple of things in passing before we go. One, we're talking about New South Wales and the raring and the lack of wind. It was interesting that they're now reshaping their auctions. They're going to have 10 gigawatts of auctions this year, and are reshaping it to make sure that solar battery hybrids are properly remunerated. So they do try to emphasise that it's not all about wind, but they just want to make sure that solar battery hybrids, probably cheaper, more modular and easier to roll out. So that's interesting that they're doing that And over in Western Australia, which actually outperformed the main grid in the last quarter with 53 or 54% renewables, but it's got a few growing pains and growth problems. It's also been slow on transmission. It hasn't got enough new wind and solar projects coming through, even though it's had a whole bunch of big batteries. And so despite swearing on the Bible, or swearing on something, that he wouldn't give them any more money, the Premier, Roger Cook, has now agreed to give Griffin Coal, which runs the loss-making mine there that supplies the coal generators, more money to keep them open for 5 years. So there you go. You make 3 steps forwards and 2 steps back, and
yes, and progress occurs because electricity prices are falling, renewable supply is increasing.
Do we know? Sorry to interrupt. Do we know the effect or the impact of the household batteries? I mean, is that visible or even documentable at all? No.
In fact, it is documented, but only with a massive lag. I wrote a big note about these regulatory information notices, which provide a lot of information about networks, and I consolidated all the data. Hopefully I didn't make too many mistakes, and it shows that the networks are importing less electricity from the grid, and that impacts their revenue model. But you can't, and we can see from within those statements how much solar is exported back to the grid. We also know if AEMO gets its estimates right, and we have to remember it's only estimates because it's not metered, how much household solar is actually produced, right? And so you can compare the two, and from that you can work out how much solar is being consumed, in theory, behind the meter. So we know how much has been exported, we know how much is produced. The difference is what's been consumed behind the meter.
And what's been stored in the battery in those critical evening peaks.
Well, we don't know anything about the batteries. We have no data on it yet.
No, but I think
we do see this flattening of electricity prices.
Yes.
We do see that.
We do see that, and we also know that despite all the heat waves that happened over summer, there was no risk or even talk of any blackouts because of shortage of supply or anything like that.
That's right. Now Paul McCardle made his very good and usual point that actually in these heat waves, wind underperforms because the wind doesn't tend to blow when it's very hot. But that is the lesser point. The bigger point is that the solar does work and takes all the stress and strain off. And then we've got the batteries. And so the power lines don't sink as much, the transmission lines, because they're not being used as hard during the day. The coal generators don't even break down as much that are left because they're not being asked to work as hard during the day, and they can save themselves for when the sun goes down. And even then they don't have to work because of the batteries. Which brings me to the final thing I want to leave you with, Giles, today. And that's, we've talked about the federal government reviews. We've talked a little bit about states. Fortunately, we haven't talked about Queensland. But if we go down the pecking order, the next thing on the list would be the AEMC and their network pricing review. And I haven't got to an exact landing on that, but I think the industry should really be putting its heads on Smart Energy Council and Clean Energy Council and the think tanks and coming to a clear position on the role that networks should have and the way that households should pay for their electricity.
Absolutely. And I think I might have mentioned this before, but we got expanded our solar and put in a battery last month. We have now basically eliminated the bill on electricity. The only thing that we have as a charge is the network charges, which up here is about $1,000 a year. And I'm just wondering, there was a time when the grid was the cheapest battery, but is it still the cheapest battery? And that's a question for all the regulators, the policymakers, the retailers, and all the experts to think about.
And of course, we're also seeing we're going over and over, but stuff. But I mean, gas usage is starting to decline, right? These trends that we talk about. We in the industry who think about it harder probably talk about them first, and then about 3 or 4 years later, much to our surprise, they actually start really happening. But anyway, that's probably enough for
Indeed. Absolutely. Wouldn't we say 4 steps forward and 2 steps back? So that's a good way to end the podcast, David. Thank you very much.
Sponsors.
Thank our sponsors, Evergen and Pylon. Thanks, Matthew England from University of New South Wales, for joining us with a fascinating discussion about our heating oceans and other aspects of climate change. Our Solar Insiders podcast has resumed. We've got a great interview with the CEO of Kaluza, talking about the sort of the change and sort of business thinking about sort of retail models and some of the smarts that can enable batteries and rooftop solar and EVs and such things. And Delaney's got a fantastic interview with Ron Ben David, the former Victoria energy regulator, about the hopeless failure of energy retailers of doing the right thing by customers. And it's actually really worth a listen, I think. And the Driven Podcast, the EV Focus one, will also be resuming next week. So that's it for us on this episode. Welcome back to the working year, everyone. And
Giles, have we got time for my grandfather's joke, thinking about the way energy retailers think about customers?
Tell me.
Well, there's the dad comes home from the factory, from the shop one day, and he's having dinner with his son. And he said to his son, "I've got this ethical problem, son." And the son said, "Oh, what's that?" And Dad said, "Oh, well, a customer came in and overpaid me $10 today." And the son said, "So what?" Well, the dad said, "Well, should I tell my partner?"
We'll have to think about that when we're going to leave that in for the podcast. But that's it for now, and we'll be back again next week.